For a long time, I've been deeply troubled by that kind of life we live, without even realizing we're living it. That half-automatic routine. Wake up, do the chores, reply to messages, fall asleep exhausted, and repeat the whole thing the next day. That feeling pushed me into a somewhat reckless adventure, which was trying to understand why the modern world, even with so many good things going for it, still left people feeling so empty inside. And to dig into this, I picked up the book, Man's Search for Meaning, by Viktor Frankl. What I found in there was a pretty heavy diagnosis, showing that this exhaustion you feel today isn't your fault. It was the symptom of a prediction made 60 years ago by a psychiatrist, one that has been gradually confirming itself all over the world. Spoiler: what he discovered explains exactly why you've been feeling so empty, even when, on paper, everything seems to be in order. Frankl had a bold intellectual plan, one that was almost impossible to pull off. He wanted to discover what he called the main engine of the human being. But this wasn't some lab theory, nor a pretty idea written up in a fancy office. He wanted something that could be tested under the worst conditions a human being has ever lived through. Viktor Emil Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905, and in 1942 he was deported to the Theresienstadt ghetto, and 2 years later transferred to other captivity camps in Central Europe during the Second World War. He never had that chance to study people in a controlled environment. He didn't test his ideas in a university research project. Look, observing people in extreme situations is, for most psychiatrists, a side gig, something you do at the tail end of your career. For him, it was his entire life for 3 years. He was forced to see the worst of humanity up close, the same way we're forced to see the traffic in the city where we live. Viktor Emil Frankl, before he was 20, was already exchanging letters with Sigmund Freud. Before he was 25, he had already broken away from Adler's circle for defending an idea that neither of the two great schools of psychotherapy in Europe accepted. He studied psychiatry and neurology at the University of Vienna, and during the 30s, he began developing an idea that was heretical to the psychoanalytic tradition of the time. The idea that human beings aren't primarily driven by pleasure, as Freud claimed, nor by the will to power, as Alfred Adler claimed, but by something more fundamental, more silent, more difficult to measure. By the search for meaning in their own existence. In 1942, his life collapsed. He was deported with his wife, his parents, and his brother Walter to the Theresienstadt ghetto. In 1944, 2 years later, he was transferred to other camps within the same system, under increasingly worse conditions. He lost his father, his mother, and his brother within a short span of months. His wife, Tilly Grosser, whom he had married shortly before the deportation, was pregnant. They were prevented from carrying the pregnancy to term by order of the totalitarian regime of the time. Tilly died shortly after of typhus, at just 24 years old. When Frankl was liberated in 1945, he was 40 years old, with no close family alive, no manuscript of the book he had started, and no certainty about what to do with the rest of the life he had left. At 40, with no one, with nothing, starting over from scratch. And then he did something that's still impressive today. In 9 days, he dictated to 3 secretaries the book that would become one of the most important works of the 20th century. Ein Psychologe erlebt das Konzentrationslager, published in German in 1946 and known in English as Man's Search for Meaning. The book, which he initially wanted to release anonymously because he didn't think it deserved attention, sold more than 16 million copies and was translated into more than 50 languages. In 1991, a survey conducted by the Library of Congress in partnership with the Book of the Month Club listed it as one of the 10 books that most influenced the lives of Americans. For a work written in 9 days by a man who had just lost everything, that's an almost impossible statistic. This authority is the first thing that needs to be made clear. He's not some armchair theorist who wrote about suffering after sipping tea in Geneva. He's a man who tested every single one of his ideas under the worst conditions ever faced by a human being. When he claims there's an irreducible space of choice within any person, he's talking about something he saw with his own eyes inside the barbed wire, in the mud, in the cold, in the hunger, with the smell of death hanging over him. It's not a metaphor. It's direct observation, made with a clinical eye, mentally noted because pencil and paper had been confiscated. And what he saw while watching his fellow prisoners was this. The ones who held on weren't the strongest physically, nor the healthiest, nor the youngest. The ones who held on were the ones who had a reason to hold on. Someone waiting on the outside, an unfinished book, a promise to keep, a mission still ahead. In one of the passages of Man's Search for Meaning itself, he tells how he would mentally reconstruct, while standing in the snow, the lost manuscript, line by line, chapter by chapter. He knew that if he made it back, he'd come back with that. And he came back, in every sense of the word. In several moments throughout the book, a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche appears that seems to have been written to describe exactly what he observed. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. It's not a motivational quote to slap on a coffee mug. It's a clinical observation made by a psychiatrist inside a place where more than 90% of the prisoners didn't come back. The central thesis became simple and devastating. Human beings can endure almost anything, as long as that anything has some meaning. When meaning fails, even comfort turns into torture. And that's exactly what's happening right now, on a massive scale, to most of the people watching this video. The concept that comes next gives a name to what you're probably feeling at this moment, even without having the words to define it. In another foundational book, The Will to Meaning, built from lectures given in the 60s in the United States, the psychiatrist presented a diagnosis that seemed exaggerated at the time and that today reads like a literal description of the world. He called the phenomenon the existential vacuum. The phrase in German is existentielles Vakuum, and it describes a very specific feeling. The feeling of a person who has everything they were supposed to have, who has fulfilled the script they were handed, who has a house, a job, relationships that look fine on the surface, and yet still feels a deep boredom, an indifference, an impression of running on a treadmill that's not going anywhere. It's the hollow that no calendar can fill. In his Viennese practice after the war, he treated thousands of patients in private practice and at the General Polyclinic Hospital in Vienna, where he directed the neurology department from 1946 to 1971, 25 consecutive years, and he started noticing a strange pattern. The patients with the hardest symptoms to treat weren't the poor or the terminally ill. They were the successful ones, doctors at the peak of their careers, executives with packed schedules, housewives in upscale neighborhoods, young heirs without a single material need. People who, according to any happiness manual of the time, should have been doing fine, but weren't. They felt hollow. Some of them spoke of dark thoughts without understanding where they came from. Others sank into addictions for no apparent reason. Others simply stopped caring about anything, in a slow shutdown of themselves. The clinical observation was of a new neurosis, one that didn't fit into the classical diagnoses. The name he gave it was neurogenic neurosis, that is, an illness born not from the conflict between repressed desires, as Freud would say, nor from the struggle for self-overcoming, as Adler would say, but from the absence of meaning in one's own existence. This category, instead of becoming an academic curiosity, exploded across the world. Today it is, under various other names, the backdrop of most of the complaints that walk into therapy offices. This is where the title of this video becomes literal, with no dramatization. In The Will to Meaning, and in interviews given in the late 60s and early 70s, the author made a prediction. He said, with the calm of someone who observes trends the way an epidemiologist observes outbreaks, that the existential vacuum would become the #1 illness of the developed world. As societies solved the problems of basic survival, a problem of another order would surge in with full force, the problem of meaning. People with full stomachs and a roof over their heads would discover that this wasn't enough, and they wouldn't know what to do with that discovery. Look around. Studies published in the scientific journal The Lancet in 2021 showed a global increase of more than 25% in cases of deep sadness and anxiety after the pandemic, with a particularly strong impact among young adults. Research conducted by the American Psychological Association in recent years indicates that the so-called Generation Z is statistically the most anxious ever recorded since this kind of data has been measured. The rates of sleeping pill use, controlled substances, and giving up on life in developed countries keep climbing. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States recorded in 2023 levels of persistent deep sadness among teenagers higher than in any other generation measured in the history of national surveys. And the paradox is exactly what he predicted. The era with the most comfort, the most options, the most technology, and the most discourse about happiness is also the era most sick on the inside. The number one illness today in the developed West isn't hunger. It isn't lack of information. It's the lack of a reason, and no one teaches this. That's the part that's worse than you think. Not because the world is falling apart, but because the problem is older and deeper than most people suspect. You're not going through a rough patch that'll pass with a vacation. You're living, alongside billions of other people, the fulfillment of a psychiatric prophecy made 60 years ago. And the worst part is that no one taught you how to recognize this, much less how to get out of it. School doesn't teach it. College doesn't teach it. The work environment rewards the very behaviors that deepen the problem. And social media algorithms keep the person occupied just enough that they never get to see what's actually happening in their own life. There's a specific trap in this culture, and it's been described with precision. It's the trap of treating happiness as a target. The logic seems obvious and is everywhere. If I want to be happy, I need to chase happiness, optimize life for it, choose decisions that increase it. Apps, books, ads, and influencers all promise this. And yet, the more someone pursues happiness directly, the more it slips away. There's a body of research in positive psychology conducted by names like Iris Mouse at the University of California, Berkeley, that confirms what he was already saying clinically back in the 50s. People who value happiness as a direct and explicit goal report, on average, higher levels of sadness and more depressive symptoms, not by chance, by design. The technical name for this phenomenon in works like The Doctor and the Soul is hyperintention, and it was treated as a clinical principle. Whoever hyperintends sleep doesn't sleep. Whoever hyperintends performance fails. Whoever hyperintends to be happy gets depressed. Happiness is a side effect. It's not a target. It's the consequence of a life with direction. You don't reach it by aiming at it. You reach it by aiming at something else, and it shows up off to the side, unnoticed, while you're busy with what matters. Think for a moment about the current culture of life optimization, with its obsessive pursuit of better productivity, better sleep, better skin, the better version of yourself. All of it sold as the path to a fuller life. The thesis was clear. This whole machine is running in reverse. It's producing exactly the hollow it promises to cure. It turns life into a race, and the race has no destination. It only has speed. And on a Tuesday morning like any other, sitting in the car in traffic, looking at the line of other cars and the headlights all on, you realize you're speeding up to get to a place you don't want to get to. Life was warning you. To understand why this conclusion is different from what other psychologists said, you have to briefly understand what he called, with dry humor, the three Viennese schools of psychotherapy. Vienna, in the early 20th century, was the world epicenter of psychological thought. Three major systems were born there, and Frankl belongs to the third. Sigmund Freud, the first school, founded psychoanalysis at the end of the 19th century. His central thesis, simplifying quite a bit, was that human beings are driven by a will to pleasure. Behind every behavior, behind every symptom, there would be a desire, an impulse, a libido seeking release. Suffering, for Freud, came from the conflict between these desires and the repressions imposed by civilization and childhood. The cure went through bringing these conflicts into consciousness, in a long process of analysis. Frankl had enormous respect for Freud, with whom he corresponded while still young, but he considered his system partial. He believed Freud had described the basement of the human psyche, but the house doesn't end at the basement. Alfred Adler, a dissident of Freud's and the founder of the second school, disagreed. For Adler, The human engine wasn't pleasure, but the will to power. More specifically, the struggle to overcome a feeling of inferiority that originated in childhood. Everything we do, according to him, is an attempt to compensate for a weakness, to assert a value, to climb a rung on the symbolic hierarchy. Adler treated patients with a more social outlook, more focused on community contexts. The acknowledgement of the advance was explicit, but the explanation still seemed incomplete. The will to power is a reaction. Something explains it. And that something needs to be named. When the psychiatrist came back from captivity, at 40 years old, with no one at home, the reading he wrote was a different one. For him, both previous thinkers were only describing symptoms. When someone compulsively chases pleasure, they're generally trying to fill a more fundamental emptiness. When someone desperately chases power, they're generally trying to give themselves an importance they feel they're missing. Beneath pleasure and power, there's something older, the internal demand for direction. Human beings want to exist for something. When that demand finds an answer, the person flourishes. When it meets silence, the person gets sick, and the symptoms appear in the most familiar forms. Addictions, excesses, depressions, the endless search for validation, paralysis, compulsive hoarding, disposable relationships in series. This explains why treatments focused only on symptoms tend to have limited results. You can treat the addiction, and it just migrates to another object. The person stops drinking and starts compulsively eating, stops eating and starts shopping, stops shopping and starts sinking into hours and hours of short-form videos. The symptom changes its costume. The cause stays the same. As long as the silent hunger for purpose isn't fed, the psychological organism keeps trying to fill the hole with the wrong material. And since the material is wrong, it never fills up. The feeling is that of a leaky pipe. You pour life into it, and it just runs out. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I left in the first pinned comment. There's a chapter in Man's Search for Meaning that quietly changes whoever reads it. It's the moment when he, describing life in the captivity sites, observes something seemingly impossible. Even stripped of everything, no name, no hair, no clothes of their own, no future, no information about their family, some prisoners still gave their bread to others. They walked through the cold to comfort a sick companion. They were able, with just a look, to recover dignity. They weren't the majority, but they existed. And their mere existence made any theory that reduced human beings to automatic impulses, to stimuli and responses, untenable. The line he wrote based on this became the core of his entire body of work. Everything can be taken from a person, except one thing, the last of the human freedoms, which is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This core that no one can reach isn't a civil right. It can't be granted by any government, nor stripped away by any oppression. It's the part of the human being that doesn't fit inside the body, the social position, the biographical history. It's the point from which even a man inside an inhuman place was still a man. Stop for a moment and consider the size of that. If that freedom existed there, it exists anywhere. It exists in a job you hate but need to keep for now, in a difficult diagnosis you didn't ask for, in a betrayal you didn't see coming. In an aging process, no one escapes. You may not have a choice over what happened, but you always have a choice over who you become in the face of what happened. This isn't positivity. It's the unbreachable inner territory. And whoever enters that territory, even hurt, even tired, stops being a hostage to circumstance. They become an author. For anyone who feels like a hostage to the routine, for anyone who thinks life is what's left over after work, this is a key that unlocks everything, because it shows that the problem was never the routine itself. The problem was giving up that last freedom inside it. The person who gives up just sits around waiting for the routine to change so they can start living. The one who doesn't give up starts living right now, inside the routine, and gradually the routine itself changes as a consequence. But there's a very common confusion that needs to be avoided about what he meant by meaning. Current culture has distorted an important idea. The notion has spread that everyone invents their own meaning, as if assembling a convenient subjective narrative. You're free, so paint your life with whatever colors you choose. That's not it. The work is, on this point, more sober and more demanding. Meaning isn't invented, it's discovered. Each concrete situation in life brings a specific question directed at that person, at that moment, with that history. The task isn't to manufacture a pretty answer, it's to respond with one's own existence. In logotherapy and existential analysis, he explains, meaning is anchored in a real situation, in concrete demands the world presents. The person doesn't create meaning out of nothing. They perceive the meaning that's already there, inside the situation, waiting to be answered by someone willing to commit to it. This seems subtle, but it changes everything. It takes away the narcissistic weight of finding yourself, as if life were a mirror to be polished, and it puts something more solid in its place. Responsibility. Meaning isn't what I want from life, it's what life is asking from me at this moment. In lectures across the United States, he used to flip the classic question. The right question isn't what I can expect from life, it's what life can expect from me. Whoever expects from life stays passive, hand outstretched, at the mercy of whatever shows up. Whoever asks what they can offer takes an active stance, even in the worst conditions. And it's that active stance that the human organism recognizes as meaning. And here, what he discovered about Sunday afternoons explains something you might have been feeling for years without a name for it. The work presents 3 pathways through which meaning can be discovered. It's worth walking through them slowly, because that's where the practical tool that will be delivered later comes from. The first pathway is that of what one creates or accomplishes. A piece of work, a job done well, a child raised with care, anything that takes shape in the world from someone's effort. It's the path of the builder. It applies equally to the engineer who finishes a bridge and to the seamstress who delivers a dress. It's not a hierarchy of prestige, it's the quality of presence in the work. Meaning on this path doesn't come from the size of what you do, but from the wholeness with which you do it. A small job, carried out with the best of whoever does it, generates meaning. A big job, done with indifference, doesn't. The second pathway is that of what one experiences or loves, and it draws attention to something that the performance-oriented culture tends to ignore. Beauty, contemplation, presence in a relationship, a sunset watched without a phone, music listened to with full attention, a conversation with a loved one without urgency. This path doesn't produce anything tangible, doesn't turn into a number on a spreadsheet, but it generates meaning in quantities just as great as the first. There are entire lives whose meaning comes from the quality of their presence, not from the quantity of works produced. Grandparents who took care of grandchildren, friends who listened in silence to someone going through a rough phase, spouses who sustained decades of life together with quiet faithfulness. These people are builders just as much as the others. They just build with a different material. The third pathway, the hardest one to accept, is that of attitude in the face of unavoidable suffering. Not the suffering that can be avoided, but the kind that comes as part of the human condition. Loss, illness, aging, farewells. Here the position is categorical, and it needs to be understood carefully so it doesn't turn into a caricature. Suffering was never romanticized. On the contrary, suffering unnecessarily, when you can change the situation, is a mistake, not heroism. But when suffering is unavoidable, when the circumstance can't be altered, the person can still choose how to walk through it. And in that choice, even pain can be turned into something that strengthens you internally, that dignifies, that humanizes. These 3 pathways cover any phase of life and any biography. What changes is which of them is most open at any given moment. For the young person full of energy, perhaps the first one. For the adult loaded with affections, perhaps the second. For someone in a difficult phase, with no easy option for change, perhaps the third is the only one available, and even so, fully sufficient. This is one of the most consoling points of the work. No one is left without a path. It may be that only one is open in a certain season of life, but there's always at least one. The question he posed, and that few people face, is simple and harsh. In which of the three have you been keeping yourself alive? In which one have you been running away? If the answer is uncomfortable, that's where the clue to what needs to change is hiding. Many people are exhausted on the first path, living only for work, and completely undernourished on the second, with no real presence with anyone. Others live the second one in excess, avoiding the first, leaving no mark on the world. Others are hostages of the third, suffering unnecessarily in situations they could change. The honest diagnosis of these three pathways in the concrete life of each person is the beginning of the work. There's a phenomenon he observed up close in his Vienna practice, and it can be described with such precision that most people recognize themselves in it immediately. He named it Sunday neurosis. It's the anguish that shows up when the rush of work stops. During the week, the pace is so intense that there's no time left to feel. Meetings, commutes, notifications pile up in such a way that the person goes through the day on autopilot and falls into bed exhausted. Sunday afternoon, however, exposes a truth that the whole week had hidden. It's 4 p.m. The house falls into a kind of strange silence. The coffee you made in the morning has gone cold on the table, and no one's going to drink it. The sun is slanting in through the living room window with that slightly yellowish quality that only shows up on Sundays. With no meetings to escape into, no urgent messages to answer, no legitimate reason to distract yourself, a silence appears that a lot of people don't know how to walk through. The nameless absence that was there the whole time appears, hidden by the speed. That absence, though uncomfortable, is the best signal that life is asking for room for something deeper. It's the psychological organism letting you know that something is out of place, and that until the person stops to listen, it'll keep on warning in increasingly uncomfortable forms. The silence is the diagnosis. The immediate temptation is to drown out that silence. Open the short video app, turn on the TV, schedule another commitment, buy something online, book a trip. Anything that makes the silence go away. The clinical serenity that was his hallmark allowed for an opposite stance. This escape is the opposite of treatment. Sunday afternoon is offering a door. Most people close it. Those who listen to what the silence is saying start to change their lives without needing any catastrophe. They change gradually, without making noise, but they change for the better. And here we come to the point where this work collides head-on with much of the contemporary discourse about high performance. There's a gigantic industry today selling the idea that more achievements will bring more meaning, more productivity, more revenue, more followers, more fitness, more focus. The productivist logic promises that the hollow is just a lack of method, and that if a person just optimizes one more piece of the routine, they'll finally arrive at a place where they'll feel good. There's an impressive amount of books, podcasts, courses, and apps selling that promise every single day. The work points to the opposite. Meaning comes from direction, not speed. It's possible, and even common, to run in the wrong direction with excellence, to accumulate achievements on a path that says nothing to the person who achieved them, to shine in a profession that empties you out, to build a fortune around values that, examined up close, aren't even your own, just copied from a culture that imposed them without asking. When the direction is wrong, speeding up doesn't fix it. It just gets you faster to a place you didn't want to end up. The question facing the current landscape of endless optimization isn't, how can I produce more? It's another, harder one. Why am I producing this? For whom? To answer what real demand and not an imitated one. To leave what kind of mark when the last day comes? These questions seem too big for a Tuesday. They're exactly the questions for a Tuesday. Putting them off is part of the problem. People who ask themselves these questions usually discover with some shock that part of what's driving their schedule isn't theirs. It's inherited. It was installed by family, by advertising, by the algorithms, by the gazes of people who aren't even around anymore. As long as that's not examined, any acceleration just makes the destination more painful. The exhaustion of someone running in the wrong direction isn't the good kind of exhaustion of someone who did what needed to be done. It's an exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. that turns into the body, turns into insomnia, turns into forgotten birthdays, turns into disorders that medical exams don't detect, but the mirror already shows. Exhaustion that sleep doesn't cure. There's a moment in The Will to Meaning where he makes a proposal that at first sounds almost humorous, but that carries the core of his ethics. He suggests, in all seriousness, that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast of the United States be complemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. The argument is simple and profound. Freedom without responsibility loses itself and makes the person sick. There's a very common confusion in contemporary discourse about freedom. Freedom is treated as a synonym for doing whatever you want, with no weight, no consequence, no commitment. Authentic adult life is the opposite. It's answering for what you love, for what you've built, for those who depend on your presence. It's having a word that's worth something, work that matters, ties that aren't disposable at the first sign of discomfort. Weight, in this reading, isn't the enemy. Weight is exactly what gives direction. People without weight float. People with weight sink their feet into the ground and walk somewhere. Whoever takes care of someone isn't chained, they're rooted. Whoever commits to a body of work isn't limited, they're building. Whoever keeps their word becomes someone you can trust, including trusting yourself. And self-trust isn't born from affirmations in the mirror. It's born from kept words, from kept promises, from days walked through with integrity when no one was watching. Current culture, with its promise of absolute lightness and frictionless relationships, sold the fantasy that weight is a disease. The observation was surgical. It's the opposite. Absolute lightness is slow insanity. Adult human life has weight, and that weight is the raw material of meaning. Whoever runs from weight turns into confetti, and confetti doesn't make it through anything. It flies, it falls, and no one remembers. There's another dimension that needs to be presented carefully, because it's where the work distances itself from much of what today is called spirituality or self-development. Here we get the so-called noetic dimension from the Greek nous, intellect, spirit, not necessarily in the religious sense. He was a thinker who respected faith, but who wrote for believers and non-believers alike. The noetic dimension is the specifically human capacity for self-transcendence, for not staying locked inside one's own ego, one's own impulses, one's own needs. The human being is only fully human when they forget themselves in service of something greater, a cause, a mission, another person they truly love. This movement, named self-transcendence, is the exact point where you access what life has to offer at its highest. The person closed in on themselves doesn't flourish. Only the one who gives themselves over to something outside themselves finds, paradoxically, their most complete form. It's a paradox, but it's also a clinical observation. The patients who got better, in his decades of experience, were the ones who could direct their energy outward. The ones who stagnated spun around themselves like dogs biting their own tails. This collides with an entire contemporary industry of looking inward. The modern obsession with infinite self-analysis, with constant mapping of one's own emotions, with successive deep dives into therapy sessions and retreats to better understand oneself, is exactly the opposite path of what cures. You don't find yourself by digging through yourself. You find yourself by giving yourself over. When life is about looking inward all the time, it shrinks. When it's about looking outward, in the direction of a person, a body of work, a cause, the inside organizes itself on its own as a byproduct. This isn't a speech against self-knowledge. It's a speech against self-knowledge as an end in itself. Knowing yourself is a means. The end is living for something. There's a point where this work answers one of the most dangerous ideas of the 20th century. The idea that the human being is just a product of circumstances. You are what your childhood was, what your genetics determined, what your social conditioning recorded. If that were true, there would be no real freedom, no real responsibility. The rejection came from empirical evidence lived in his own body. The captivity sites were, from a determinist standpoint, an extreme situation. If people were just a product of circumstance, they would all have reacted the same way. That's not what happened. Some came undone in just a few days. Others found within the horror room for impossible gestures of dignity. Circumstance, no matter how harsh, doesn't completely determine the response. There's always, even if extremely narrow, a space of choice. It's in that space that the human resides. The practical consequence is sharp. You can no longer justify yourself by your story. A difficult childhood explains, but doesn't determine. Genetics explain, but don't determine. The generation you were born into explains, but doesn't determine. At some point, always, there's a space for decision. And in that space is where you decide who you become. It's not a comfortable position. It's demanding. But it's exactly that demand that gives the human being back the dignity of being, to some extent, the author of their own life. And what he discovered about the past might change the way you look at the years that have already passed. By this point, a weight might be settling in. A feeling that the problem is too big, too old, and that maybe it's too late to reorganize everything. This is the moment to take a breath and say, with full clarity, what he repeated in every phase of his work until he died at 92 in 1997. Age doesn't matter. Phase doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what's already been lived or what's been left unlived. As long as there's life, there's the possibility of meaning. He went through the worst that a human being can go through and still affirmed with his entire life that existence has meaning under any circumstance, that the past isn't a prison, but a storehouse. What was done was done. It can't be undone. And in that immutability lies a form of eternity. Every hour well lived is stored, definitively, in what he called the granary of the past. Nothing that's been lived with meaning is lost. Not even death takes that away. A person can grow old, lose strength, lose memory, and still, what they lived remains untouched in time already fulfilled. This principle was named the transitoriness of existence, and it was treated as a reason for seriousness, not despair. Every hour is unique, unrepeatable. Precisely because of that, every hour carries weight. Every hour asks for attention. Every hour asks for attention. This means that the unease most people feel today isn't the end of anything, it's a beginning. It's life letting you know, while there's still time, that there's a more truthful path available. Not tomorrow, when everything is perfect. Today, with the health you have, with the age you have, with what's left, and with what's still here. Putting it off is an elegant form of refusal, and life will collect on that refusal in some form, sooner or later. There's a mental exercise he proposed in his sessions. He'd ask the patient to imagine being near the end of their life, looking back, and to ask, from that imagined position, what would have been worth doing, and what would have been wasted time. The operation seems simple, but its effect is surgical. It pulls the person out of autopilot. It brings into focus, with uncomfortable clarity, the distance between what they're living and what deep down they consider worthy of having been lived. Whoever does this exercise honestly tends to come out of it with clear decisions. Small ones usually, but clear. And the sum of small clear decisions over the years is what produces a life with a shape of its own. Now we've reached the moment for the concrete tool promised at the start. It's possible to extract from the 3 pathways for discovering meaning 3 practical questions that can be carried for the rest of your life. Questions that replace the abstract search for meaning with a daily practice, applicable starting today, from any point, in any condition. The first question is born from the path of creation, of accomplishment, of the work itself. What can I build, create, offer, or take care of that only I, with my specific history, with my specific gifts, with the people who have crossed my life, can put into the world? This question isn't asking about romantic passion or about what excites you. It's asking what's missing in the world that only you can offer. It can be small, local, quiet, but it's yours. The answer doesn't come in a day. It can take months. But the moment it appears, even partially, it reorganizes priorities. It makes the hours worked carry weight in a different way. It gives back to work the function it should have had all along, and that modern culture has been stealing away with its prefabricated meaning packages. The second question is born from the path of love, of encounter, of presence. Who can I love and care for with more presence starting today, and am I really doing that? The question has two sides. The first is identification. Who are the people who deserve the best of your attention, your time, your inner availability? There are probably few of them. There always are. The human capacity for deep affection is structurally limited. You can't love 1,000 people. You can love 5 or 6 well. Whoever spreads themselves too thin just dilutes themselves. The second side of the question is honest diagnosis. Are you really delivering that presence? Or are you distracted, partial, with half your head somewhere else? Picture the scene. You're having dinner with someone you really care about. The conversation starts to get good, one of those rare ones. Then, in the middle of an important sentence, the phone vibrates on the table, the screen lights up, and the gaze, yours, not theirs, drifts away for 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds cost more than they seem to. Being physically in front of someone and mentally somewhere else is a subtle form of absence that makes relationships sick to the point where the bond simply falls apart from starvation. Loving is more an act than a feeling. It's the decision to be fully present with someone. The third question is born from the hardest path, that of attitude in the face of what cannot be changed. In the face of what's beyond my power to modify, what dignified posture do I choose to take? There's always something in life that can't be changed. A diagnosis received, a definitive loss, an age that keeps advancing. The question is simple and cutting. Are you going to walk through this as a reactive victim or as a whole person? There's no control over the event. There's control over the posture. And posture is the last human territory. Whoever holds onto that territory holds onto themselves. Whoever gives it up loses something that no amount of money can rebuild later. These 3 questions, taken seriously, do the work that entire courses don't do. Not because they're magical, because they put at the center of the day the only thing that actually leads an adult life somewhere. Active responsibility for what you can offer, for those you can love, for what you have to walk through. Bringing them into a Tuesday morning like any other already changes the way the rest of the week unfolds. Bringing them into the years to come, with persistence, is what builds biographies worthy of being lived. None of this is about intensity. In his clinical practice, he didn't ask people to turn into heroes or heroines. He treated housewives, teachers, shopkeepers, ordinary elderly people. What he proposed was accessible, small faithful decisions, day after day, a word kept with a child, a job done right, a morning enjoyed without a phone, a difficulty walked through without becoming a different person inside. These gestures, repeated with awareness, add up to more meaning than any spectacular event. And for whoever is going through a difficult phase, walking through real pain, it's worth saying clearly, the work is not about pretending that everything is fine. Not for a single moment. Sadness is a legitimate part of the human experience, and there's even a kind of sadness tied to what wasn't lived or to what was lost. That's a sign of health, not illness. Denying that sadness with a forced smile is what logotherapy rejects. The point isn't positivity, it's wholeness. Life has phases, some of building, others of mourning, others of waiting. Trying to force them all to look like phases of building is a subtle violence against yourself. Even in mourning, the path of attitude is open. Even in waiting, the path of love. Even in exhaustion, there's a small space for possible creation. Meaning doesn't arrive as an epiphany that changes everything all at once. It doesn't come from an expensive trip or a definitive course. It's built in small repeated decisions added up over the years. Taking care of someone with real attention. Keeping your word even when you could break it without any apparent consequence. Doing the work that's in your hands well. Walking through a difficulty without losing your shape. Appreciating a morning, a conversation, a silence, without needing to turn everything into content. That's what, at the end of the day, gets called a life with meaning. Viktor Frankl walked through the worst that a human being can walk through. He came out the other side, wrote the work he wrote, married again to Eleanor Schwint, had a daughter, lived to 92 years old teaching, treating patients, giving lectures around the world, receiving 29 honorary degrees from universities around the world, and serving as a visiting professor at Harvard, Stanford, Duquesne, and Southern Methodist. And he affirmed with his entire life that existence has meaning under any circumstance, at any age, for any person who decides to look for it where it actually lives, and not where the culture promises you'll find it. The final invitation is simple. Start today with the 3 questions. The answers come with time, with practice, with the life you live from now on. And it's exactly that life that becomes the answer. There's no secret somewhere else. There's just the work, patient and dignified, of someone who decides to respond to what their own existence is asking for. If this video made sense to you, leave your like, subscribe to the channel to follow the next ones, and consider joining our members club, where we go deeper into these themes in a way that doesn't fit here. Good thoughts, and until our next meeting.